Let's discuss about the ITTOs. First, the inputs. In that, the first one is project management plan. There are three. Resource management plan. The resource management plan describes what resources are needed for the project, identifies the resource available to the project, outlines assumptions related to the resources, and explains how resources will be managed. Knowing this information will help you to identify risk related to resources and assign allocation of resources to risk responses. So, naturally, it becomes an input. Risk management plan. Planned risk response needs information such as type of risk owners, their roles and responsibilities, and their availability, risk threshold of the organization, so that the timing to trigger the risk response can be identified. Risk management plan will have these information. Cost baseline. Information about the contingency fund that is allocated to risk response is part of cost baseline. So naturally it's an input. The next one is project documents. Lessons learned register. Lessons learned regarding effective risk responses used in earlier project are reviewed to determine if similar response might be useful in this project. Project schedule. The schedule is used to determine how agreed upon risk responses will be scheduled along with other project activities. Project team assignments. Project team assignments can show the response that can be allocated to agreed upon risk responses. Resource calendars. Resource calendars identify when potential resources are available to be allocated to agreed upon risk responses. As a project manager, you have to review this calendar regularly to verify that all the resources are available as scheduled to avoid threat and find opportunities. Risk register. Typically, the risk register contains details about individual risks. Depending on the priority of each risk, the appropriate risk responses are selected. Priority risk may require proactive response strategies and or priority action. The non-priority risk can put on back burner. The risk register identifies the nominated risk owners for each risk. It may also contain preliminary risk response identified. Other data can assist in planning risk response, including root cause, risk trigger, and warning signs. Risk requiring responses in the near term and the risk that needs additional analysis. Risk report. This report may have certain information that helps to plan risk response strategies such as priority risk, risks that have high impact, and risks that are high exposure. On analyzing the type of risk trend, metrics, and risk source can help to find more information about the risk and the risk response plan accordingly. Stakeholder register. The stakeholder register identifies potential owners for risk response. The third input is enterprise environmental factors. Organizations and stakeholders' risk appetite, tolerance, and thresholds help you to identify the impact of risk, rank them, and determine which risk response strategies to use. The fourth is organizational process assets. Here, historical database and lessons learned repository from similar projects, risk from past similar projects, templates for the risk management plan, risk register, and risk reports are some of the organizational process asserts that are used as inputs. Now, tools and techniques. First, expert judgment. Planned risk response primarily involves in threat response strategies, opportunity response strategies, contingent response strategies, and overall project risk response strategies. So, the subject matter expertise relevant to the specified individual project risk, planned risk response strategies become part of SME pool. Second is interviews and data gathering. Interviews. Development of response to individual project risk and overall project risk may be undertaken during structured or semi-structured interviews with risk owners. Other stakeholders may also be interviewed if necessary. The third one, interpersonal and team skills, is facilitation. Let's talk about it. The use of facilitation improves the effectiveness of developing response to individual project risk and overall project risk. A facilitator risk owner can help the risk owners to understand the risk, identify and compare alternative possible response strategies, choose an appropriate response strategy, and identify and overcome source of bias. Now let's talk about the strategies for threat. Primarily, there are 5 strategies to manage with threat. First, escalate. In the project, threat can come from any corner. You need to escalate the risk when the threats are outside the scope of the project, or you as a project manager lack an authority to proceed further to manage the threat, or you don't have the resources or the knowledge required to manage it. Of course, this should be done in agreement with sponsor. The escalate threats are managed at program level or portfolio level or other relevant part of organization, but not at project level. The project manager determines who should be notified about the threat and communicates the details to that person or to the respective organization. It's important that ownership of escalated threats is accepted by the relevant party in the organization. Escalated threats are not monitored further by the project team after escalation. Typically, they get recorded in the risk register for information. The next strategy is avoid. The word avoid may look a little confusing, but let's get into the detail. You will understand them easily. Here, the project team acts to eliminate the threat to protect the project from its impact. This approach is appropriate for high priority threats with high probability of occurrence and high negative impact. You may even do changes in the project plan so that the entire risk itself gets eliminated, or you try to reduce the probability of occurrence to zero. This is the best technique to manage risk. However, this cannot be applied all the times. Let's go back to the construction example. If it's going to rain and spoil all the construction work, the only way to avoid this is to postpone the work by few weeks or few days after the rain. Some of the other actions may include removing the root cause of the threat, rescheduling, change the strategy, or the worst case scenario is to reduce the scope. Sometimes risk can be avoided by clarifying the requirements, obtaining more information, improving communication, or acquiring the expertise. The next strategy is mitigate. If you can't avoid the risk, what is the natural action? Exactly, you try to reduce at least the probability and the impact of threat. And that's what you do in risk mitigation. In risk mitigation, you take actions to reduce the probability of occurrence and or impact of a threat. Early mitigation is better so that the damages will be less. Let's look at an example. When the product is big and complex, rather than doing it in a scaled up manner, you better build a prototype or scale down model so that all bigger risks can be mitigated. Adapting less complex process, conducting more tests, choosing more stable seller are some of the examples of mitigation. Transfer. In transfer risk response strategy, you transfer the risk to a third party to manage it. Please note that transferring does not eliminate the risk. It only shifts the responsibility of managing the risk to a third party. In the construction example, when a client asks you to set up a special office room, which is not part of the original scope, you better outsource the work to a third party because you don't have enough experience in managing it. That's an example. Here, with the third party, you can use fixed price contract so that risk from the buyer side gets reduced. You can use the strategy when you lack skill or resources to manage the risk. Since you have transferred all the responsibilities as a whole to the third party, now it becomes their responsibility to complete the task within agreed time and budget. But don't forget the fact that transferring a risk can cause a secondary risk. For example, although you had given the work to the third party and it's their responsibility to manage the risk, but still you are accountable for the deliverable. Taking insurance is another type of risk transfer. Risk transfer often involves payment of a risk premium to the party taking on threat. Transfer can include not only insurance, but also performance bonds, warranties, guarantees, etc. Accept. That's the next strategy. In accept, You just accept the risk, acknowledge its existence. You don't take any action, you just leave it as it is. This strategy may be appropriate for low priority threat, or it's not cost effective to take the threat further and manage it. Acceptance can be either active or passive. One of the most common active acceptance strategies is to establish a contingency reserve, which includes time, money, or resource to face the threat if it occurs. In passive acceptance, you periodically review the threat to ensure that it does not change significantly. Now, let's talk about the strategies for opportunities. Just like for threats, there are primarily 5 strategies used to deal with opportunities. First, escalate. In the project, opportunities can come from any corner. When the opportunities are outside the scope of the project, or you as a project manager lack an authority to proceed further to grab the opportunity, or you don't have the resources or the knowledge required to manage them, then you can escalate this. The escalated opportunities are managed at the program or portfolio or relevant part of the organization, but not at the project level. The project manager determines who should be notified about the opportunity and communicates the details to that person or part of that organization. Escalated opportunities are not monitored further by the project team after escalation, although they may be recorded in the risk register for information. The next one is exploit. The exploit strategy is selected for the high priority opportunities where the organization wants to ensure that the opportunity is realized. Note the word, you do not try to realize the opportunity, but you ensure that the opportunity is realized by increasing the probability of occurrence to 100%. Let's go back to the construction example. Based on the last 10 years of data, you understood that most of the customers buy new house during the summer, just for this example. According to the current project plan, you will not be able to complete the construction before summer. You see the opportunity of completing the work before summer by crashing, fast tracking, and doing overtime. This is a huge opportunity to sell all the houses. So you do everything to complete the project before summer. Enhance. The enhance and exploit are very similar except one small difference or one big difference. The difference between exploit and enhance is the effort you put in. In exploit, you do every possible thing to make sure that 100% the opportunity will be realized. But in enhance, the current one, you do maximum possible. You do your level best, but you don't ensure 100%. Next, share. Let's go back to our construction example. The government has released a tender to construct a government building. But the project has to be completed within the next 6 months. Your organization had put already the best resources in the current project. So you cannot take out those resources from the current project. So as a result, due to lack of resources, you will not be able to take the new government project. But your organization feels that the government project can bring in a lot of revenue to the organization and also a good reputation. What do you do now? There is another construction company, let's call it as XYZ, who's not as big as yours, also wants to take up this project. One of the government rules says that the construction company has to pay a quite big amount of money as a collateral security to take up the project. The XYZ company is not big enough to pay the collateral security, but they do have the resources. Your organization can pay the collateral security, but you do not have the resources. What do you do now? In this situation, to capitalize the opportunity, you can have a joint venture with the company XYZ and take up the government project, which will be a win-win situation. Some of the other examples of sharing actions include forming a risk-sharing partnership, teams, special purpose companies, and joint ventures, which we discussed in this example. The next strategy is accept. In accept, just accept the opportunity, acknowledge its existence. You don't take any action, you just leave it as it is. This strategy may be appropriate for low priority opportunities, and maybe it is not worthwhile in terms of cost perspective to take up this opportunity further. Acceptance can be either active or passive. One of the most common active acceptance strategy is to establish a contingency reserve, which includes time, money, and resource to take the opportunity if it occurs. In passive acceptance, you periodically review the opportunity to ensure that it does not change significantly. All right, now let's talk about the contingent response strategy, which is the next tools and technique. The dictionary meaning for contingent is depending upon. Depending upon certain situation, a risk response should be executed. One of the classical example is missed out intermediate milestone. There should be a risk response in place in case if the intermediate milestone is missed out. The reason for missing the milestone could be due to any identified risk, and the risk response should be in place. Let's discuss about strategies for overall project risk. Risk response should be planned and implemented not only for individual project risk but also to address overall project risk. The same risk response strategies that are used to deal with individual project risk can also be applied to overall project risk. Let's quickly rush through them. First, avoid. Wherever the level of overall project risk is significantly negative and outside the agreed upon risk threshold for the project, an avoid strategy may be adopted. This involves taking focused action to reduce the negative effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole and bring the project back within the threshold. One example in avoidance of overall project risk is to remove all the high risk elements from the scope of the project. If it is not possible to bring back the project within the threshold, then you may cancel the project. Of course, this represents most extreme degree of risk avoidance, and it should be used only if the overall level of threat is and will remain as unacceptable. Next, exploit. This involves taking action to capture the positive effects of uncertainty to the project as a whole, adding high benefit scope elements into the project. Transfer or share. If the level of overall project risk is high but the organization is unable to address it effectively, a third party may be involved to manage the risk on behalf of the organization. Transfer can be used when the overall project risk is negative. Don't forget the transfer will involve payment of a risk premium. In case of high positive overall project risk, ownership may be shared in order to recap the associated benefits. Example of both transfer and share strategies are setting up a collaborative business structure. The next one is mitigate or enhance. The mitigation strategy is used where overall project risk is negative and enhancement applies when it is positive. Example of mitigation or enhancement strategies includes replanning the project, changing the scope and boundaries of the project, modifying project priority, changing the resource allocations, and adjusting delivery times. The last one is accept. Where no proactive risk response strategy is possible to address overall project risk, the organization may choose to continue with the project as currently defined, even if overall project risk is outside the agreed upon threshold. Acceptance can be either active or passive. The most common active acceptance strategy is to establish an overall contingency reserve for project, including amount of time, money, or resource to be used if the project exceeds its thresholds. Passive acceptance involves no proactive action apart from periodic review and the level of overall project risk. This is done to ensure that it does not change significantly. Alternative analysis, cost-effective analysis are the two data analysis techniques that are used here in data analysis. That's the next tools and technique. First, alternatives analysis. For a risk, there could be multiple reasons. Depending on the characteristics and the requirements of the risk, The most optimal risk response should be selected. Alternative analysis assists to achieve this. Next, cost benefit analysis. Here, the impact of individual project risk converted to monetary value. This helps to understand the risk response strategies and its alternatives in terms of cost effectiveness. Cost effectiveness equals change and impact level divided by implemented cost. Obviously, the higher the number, the better the effective response. The next one is decision making. Here, multi-criteria decision analysis is a decision-making technique. When planned for risk response, one or more risk response strategies are possible. Decision-making technique can help to prioritize risk response strategies. Multi-criteria decision analysis uses a decision matrix to provide a systematic approach for establishing key decision criteria, evaluating and ranking alternatives, and selecting the preferred options. You can consider one or multiple criteria when planning for risk response selections, such as cost of response, impact of risk if it occurs, effectiveness of response, effect on risk response on related risks, introduction of secondary risk, resource availability, and timing constraint, urgency, proximity, and dormancy. All right, let's talk about the outputs. The first one is change request. The planned risk response may have impact on cost and or schedule baselines or other components of the project management plan. This may trigger change request, which should be, of course, handled through perform integrated change control. I would have told a million times by now. The next one is project management plan updates. There are 7 components of project management plans that are updated here. Let's look at them. First, schedule management plan. Changes to the schedule management plan, such as changes to resource loading and leveling, or updates to the schedule strategy, are incorporated as an output of plan risk response. Cost management plan. Cost management plan, such as changes to cost accounting, tracking, and reports, as well as updates to the budget strategy and how contingency reserves are consumed or incorporated. Quality management plan. Depending on the planned risk response, changes to quality management plan, such as changes in approaches, quality control process, are incorporated. The next one is resource management plan. Changes to the resource management plan, such as changes to resource allocation, as well as updates to the resource strategy, are incorporated. Procurement management plan. Changes to procurement management plan, such as make or buy decision or contract type, gets updated. Scope baseline. When the approved changes are incorporated, the scope baseline may go for a change, so as the risk in the project and the risk response to be updated accordingly. Schedule baseline. All the approved changes must be incorporated in project. Those approved changes will impact the project schedule. Due to this, the earlier planned risk response may have to be updated. Cost baseline. The planned risk response may incur certain cost which should be updated in cost baseline. Next, project documents updates. First, assumption log. As an output to planned risk response, new assumptions may be made, new constraints may be identified, and existing assumptions and or constraints may be revisited and changed. So, assumption log should be updated with this new information. Cost forecasts. Planned risk response may demand to change the forecasted cost. Lessons learned register. The lessons learned register is updated with information about risk responses that may be useful for future phase or future projects. Project schedule. Of course, you have to implement the agreed upon risk responses, right? To do that, you need to plan for activities. Those activities need to be added as a part of project schedule. Simple. Project team assignments. Once the risk responses are confirmed, the necessary resources should be allocated to each actions associated with the risk response, naturally. These resources includes suitably qualified and experienced personnel to execute the agreed upon actions. Typically, this includes specific budget and time for the action and also technical resources to complete the action. Risk register. Updates in the risk register may include risk response strategy, specific action to implement the strategy, trigger conditions, symptoms, and warning signs of a risk occurrence, budget and schedule activities required to implement the responses, contingency and feedback plan if the primary response is adequate, residual risks that are expected to remain, and accepted residual risks. Secondary risks that arise as outcome of a risk response implementation. The last one is a risk report. Changes to agreed upon risk responses gets updated in risk report. All right, that wraps up the ITTO. Let's move to the next process.